What becomes different for a person when their need for touch is satisfied?
I missed what you said, Aaron.
What becomes different for a person when their need for touch is satisfied?
Is satisfied?
Yeah.
I'm not sure there is an end point of satisfaction with that. I think what we awaken is perhaps the first conscious acknowledgement of the lack. It's very difficult to feel a lack when it's always been a lack. It's only when you feel something different you can look back and say, oh my God, where has this been all my life? So I don't see it as achieving satisfaction. I see it as an awakening of a thirst for what has been lacking that is never ending, really.
That makes sense to me. I've had many moments where there's grief upon the arrival of something beautiful.
Right.
Grief of what hasn't been there.
I mean, no matter how marvelous any particular experience of wonderful sex is, it doesn't permanently quench your appetite.
How about in a moment when there's been a need for touch and then that need is met? What changes in someone's system?
Well, yeah, again, I think that's a moment of awakening, not a sense of satiety.
I'm going to throw the question back to you.
Okay.
Having received both of our touch, what's your experience
It's
with
your
satiety?
question. It's your question, so.
I like your answer. I think it's partly a safety and a nourishment, and partly a recognition of the need. I think my hugging actually came out of that quite a bit. The recognition of the need from the absence, and then the meeting it.
Well, I have a thought, that we have grown up in a culture, both in the United States and in our European forebears, who has been touch deprived and touch phobic, pleasurable touch being a danger to the soul for many brands of our spiritual tradition. And what I see awakening in the people that I've been in contact with is just the endless possibilities of a kind of enrichment that has been culturally horrifyingly suppressed. And it's not like filling the sponge, it's like a drop of water hitting an infinite sponge. And I think, we're not only helping people with their physical infirmities, we're adding a tincture to a long history of acculturated and religious tradition that has been enormously damaging, and it's not only discounting but vilifying of the pleasure of touch. It's a touch-dry world out there.
Again, recently, because I was just teaching, the question came up that in schools, teachers are not allowed to touch the children at all, where that was not true. Of course, they did it also by knocking you some when I was young, but that you could sit on their lap and
Right.
they could give you a hug. And so the people teaching dance was a workshop. They were saying when they were studying dance, the teacher was able to give them touch. Correction, and now they're not allowed to do that. So it actually intensified at the same time that things are getting freer. Well, we see that quite dramatically now. Things are becoming also much more
Well, I think here we come to loggerheads with another strand in our culture, not only the spiritual phobia of touch, but the litigiousness of the possibilities of anything leaking over into anything that smacks of intrusive, abusive touch. But what happens with that overreaction is that it turns out one of the most abusive things you can do to a child is not give them nourishing touch. So we've thrown out all the babies trying to clean up some phobic bathwater and protecting them in the name of the possibility of child abuse and abusing them in an entirely more pernicious but equally destructive way, I think. And if children don't receive nourishing touch, that organism requires a loving, tactile interaction in order to develop and mature properly. And without it, all kinds of things, psychological, neurological, physiological, just go haywire. I mean, this was really the core theme of my book, Job's Body. Not only here's how touch affects you, but that without touch, you will die.
On an individual level, how would you approach someone in a therapeutic context who doesn't like to be touched, who's grown up with a lack of touch, who is acculturated or in their system? Do you think it's in their best interest that they learn a better comfort with touch, or that their protective boundary go undisturbed? And if you would want to help them learn a better comfort with touch, how would you engage that?
Well, it depends. They're not likely to come to a BMC class.
That was my thought. Yeah, there's a self-selective process.
On the other hand, it happens with children. One of the first things when I was working more with kids, many, many years, but not so much now, I would ask the child at maybe 4 or something, why did you come today? And the answer was usually, my mother made me. So I'd say, well, now that you're here, do you see anything that you'd like, or, or a little bit older, well, are you having any difficulty in school that maybe we could look at? And often one of the things which isn't going to happen today because of the way education is, well, I don't have good handwriting. That was a safe thing. All right, well, let's look and explore that. So it wasn't necessarily about touch at all. Or we could, play on the balls or do different things. So I don't only have touch. Or I'm thinking one young man, his mother had him come because of a drug problem. I don't remember what we did, but we just talked. And he stopped. So there's a way we can touch without touching also, without the physical contact, because we're touching through space.
I think there is a gradient, though. This question actually came from a friend of mine who grew up with a lack of touch, and I think in your story too, Deane, and also in mine, there was a kind of conscious choice at some point to want more touch in our lives, but a negotiation with our culture and patterning that's...
Well, one thing that's been going on in my mind in the last moments was that nobody comes into my practice who for some reason hasn't been told by somebody or suggested by some slight experience of theirs that they're in trouble and they need something, and they've been told this might help, and they're still extraordinarily chary of being touched. And the answer to that is cautiously and slowly and with verbal assent every step of the way. Is this tolerable? Is this okay? Is this pleasant, unpleasant? And then it's a negotiation of meeting their threshold wherever that may be. And being very careful not to overstep, because that overstep might be terminal in terms of our ability to relate.
And also that at any moment you can say stop.
Yes.
And you can push me away. That's a very big step.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very big step. If I touch you and you don't like it, push me away.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't push you. Yes, you can. I'm going to give you a little more pressure. You feel that pressure? Use it. It's can actually be very helpful if we're in sync. But to be able to say no,
Right.
don't touch me, can be what's actually needed.
Right.
And for somebody who's been burned by fire, how to lead them into learning how to warm themselves with it. And it can be tricky, but that's the threshold of, if they're willing to come, I will do my best to find that threshold. But I loved your examples. That's exactly.
Yeah, and also water can be helpful. And there are people like, I don't know Watsu, but I have my own way of doing where you say, well, maybe go to someone who works in the water so that you're touched by the water. It's not maybe so threatening. Or then you have noodles, those different ways in which you then can move the noodles. Or, anyway, looking for what might work. And if it's a baby, it's one thing, or a young child, or a teenager, or old person.
This was always something that was very interesting to me in my going out on the street and offering hugs to people, because it's a different setup than, right, who would come to me as a client is more self-selective. Who would hug me on the street is also self-selective, but everyone's engaging with it, whether they're engaging with it by being upset at it or and always interested me there, like, what's the invitation? What's the invitation that cultivates the safety just a little bit more for each person?
You learned a lot on this street.
Yeah. Including who not to hug, lest you land up on your can on the sidewalk.
Right? Well, that was a later lesson. So more broad cultural question, if you were wanting to promote the cause of there being more positive touch in the world, in our culture, outside of just the kinds of cuddly communities that I exist in here in the Bay Area, how would you do that? What do you think needs to be addressed to make less strong the resistance to touch being a valuable part of our lives?
Well, you just asked the question that I think involves a description of the last 40 years of my life. I mean, I think that's what we do on that broader level.
Can it be done on a larger scale, or is it one person at a time?
Touch is bird by bird. You know? There's no way to quickly generalize the experience of touch. It has to be one at a time. This is where the words come in, and Milton's thing, how to use the words to entice towards the experience. But the experience, I cannot give that experience to an auditorium full of people, no matter how much they paid for it and what their expectations are.
I think I could do with an auditorium full of people.
I bet you can.
I bet you could too. Because we've been in auditoriums together.
That's right. That's right.
I remember back in Germany.
Well, there is a way of using the word and the tone to
you would be able
to evoke that physical response. Yes, I agree. Yes, absolutely. But there is no generalizable substitute for that, in a sense.
Right, they would have to touch each other, then they have to be willing to.
Right.
Although one of the things that I do is when people touch themselves, and before touching each other, and I'd say, like, put one of your hands on your leg, usually sitting on the floor, or it could be in an auditorium, and can you just quietly begin to feel how the cells, fluid, in your hand are moving toward the place of contact, and then how the place in your leg is moving to the place of contact. There's some kind of an energetic, physical movement. And then how if you wait long enough, your whole body will know that your hand is here and your leg is here and your foot will know and your head will know.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you touch your other hand without that, they're very different,
Mm-hmm.
without that connection. And that to release, you actually have to allow space to come between.
Mm-hmm.
And then they might be able to do that with a person next to them. One person, not two at a time, that would be a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Or touch a part of your body or something. So I think we are developing ways, certainly in every class that you teach, you have to begin somewhere.
Yeah. Well, you're reminding me of a thing I have used in a larger group setting of just placing your hand on your own leg and have a partner just lightly stroke your tissue with a pleasurable feeling and just experience that for 3 minutes and tell me what just happened there.
So again.
Very often the room just explodes into crosstalk and chatter and stimulation and oh my God, yeah.
There's part of it too, crossing the bridge to pleasure being something people enjoy and don't resist.
Oh, I am a absolute believer in the pleasure principle. People, and to enjoy morally and psychologically safe pleasure is a huge leap. Because we have been so phobic for so many reasons. But
part of it, given permission to enjoy.
yeah, yes.
And then there's the Buddhist one, you're not just given permission, you are told that is a precept. To be happy.
Mm.
Thou shalt be happy, that's a precept. So there are lots of ways to just even have heard that many years ago was quite, I'd never heard it before.
Mm. Certainly not a precept in many of our more astringent forms of our religious heritage.
You know, pleasure is a big part of the Traeger work, right?
Oh, very much so. Bathing in a vast sea of pleasantness. Yes. Yeah.
There you are.
That's right. That's right. And again, the approach is cautious. It begins with the tiniest incursion of awakening the whisper of pleasure through the tissue to the mind. Yeah, I mean, pleasure was at the heart of his work, and awakening to delight, and beginning to understand the infinite capacities for tactile and emotional joy, almost no matter how banged up or disabled we become. There is some piece of our existence that can be pleasured.
How did you were exposed to so many amazing people? How did you come to choose Traeger? I know you also studied with other people.
Yeah. He came to Esalen one time at the invitation of Betty Fuller, who went on to be the founder of his institute and the primary conduit for his work out into the world. And he gave a demonstration one night, and it was taped. I believe Esalen still has that tape in its archive if it hasn't been destroyed by time. And I was in the front row watching this guy do his thing and movement and pleasure and delight coming out of this woman on the table. And you can just see me with snot and tears running down my face and soaking my t-shirt. And my experience was sitting there was, I have never seen anything like this in my life. And if I can have that and learn to do that, there's nothing more I want. Mm. And I mean, I was an instant convert, and I became one of his earliest students. They said, for whatever reason, this is the guy that blows my skirt up, you know, and I just followed it. He was a remarkable man. He walked into a room and the room changed. He just, going back to the non-touch touch, he exuded a sense of peace and ease and calm and yin power that I have seldom experienced. He was a version of the Dalai Lama in his way. I mean, he just walked into a room and it was different. And I was a very slow learner. Boy, was I cocksure. Boy, did I know what I was about, you know. And he busted my chops, oh my God. He'd come to the table and slap my hands away and say, what you're doing is horrible. It was 15 years before I shook his hand and he said finally, oh, soft. But somehow I recognized that this guy had something I very deeply wanted, and if I was going to get it, I had to surrender every inch of myself to accept.
Thank you.
Mm.